Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're opening up a file that honestly contains the blueprint for modern South Asian history.
It really does. We're talking about the Anglo-Maratha Wars.
Exactly. And this isn't, just one single conflict. It's this sprawling, 43-year political and military struggle.
All the way from 1775 right up to 1818. It defines an entire era of transition.
And our mission here isn't just to go through the battles, is it? We want to understand how it all happened.
Precisely. How did the English East India Company manage to dismantle what was, at the time, the dominant power in India?
And it wasn't just military force. The sources are so clear on this. It was diplomacy, strategy, and just ruthless exploitation of internal weakness.
This period, it's really the final act. By the time the curtain falls in 1818, the EIC's authority is basically unchallenged.
So this is more than just military history. It's a study in political disintegration versus a unified corporate strategy.
That's a great way to put it. We have to stop thinking of it as a war against a single empire. It was the systematic takedown of a powerful but fatally fractured confederacy.
And the stakes for everyone living there couldn't have been higher. This was the last great indigenous power standing in the way of total British control.
So let's jump in. Let's look at the board as it was in 1775.
Okay, so if you're looking at a map of India in the mid-18th century, the old Mughal Empire is, well, it's a shadow of its former self.
It's receding into memory, really. And in that vacuum, you have two enormous powers rising and vying for control.
On one side, you've got the burgeoning EIC. They've already got their power base locked down in Bengal. They control the coastlines.
They're the dominant European power, no question. But on the other side, you have the Marathas.
The ones who had essentially stepped into the Mughal shoes, the paramount Indian power.
Absolutely. So a clash was, it was completely inevitable.
But the way they were structured made it a very unequal fight from the get-go.
Deeply unequal. The British, represented by the EIC, they had this singular focus.
Profit and expansion.
Profit and expansion, backed by modern, disciplined armies. The Marathas, on the other hand, they were much more complex.
Complex is a good word for it. Our sources really hammer this home, don't they? The Maratha power was immense, but it was fundamentally decentralized.
That's the crucial point. It wasn't a unified empire with a single chain of command. It was a confederacy.
A structure that came out of their rapid expansion, right?
Exactly. As they expanded in the early 18th century, powerful military families were given autonomy over huge territories in exchange for service. So the power ended up being distributed among 5 key players.
Okay, let's nail down who these 5 were, because their rivalries are what drive every single twist and turn of these wars.
Right. So at the center, you have the nominal head of the entire confederacy. That's the Peshwa, based in Pune.
He was originally the prime minister, but the office had become hereditary by this point.
Yeah, so he held the central authority on paper, but his actual power was constantly being challenged or even sabotaged by 4 incredibly powerful regional chiefs.
The great military families who governed these massive swaths of land.
Precisely. You had the Bonsal family, who were dominant in the east, around Nagpur.
Okay.
Then you had the 2 big military heavyweights in central and northern India. First, the Scindia family, based out of Gwalior.
And their great rivals, the Holkars.
And the Holkar family, based in Indore. And finally, out west in Gujarat, you had the Gaikwad family in Baroda.
So if they all worked together, you'd have a military force that was probably unmatched in India at the time.
On paper, yes, a formidable force. But in reality, you had 5 powerful centers, each with its own agenda, its own ambitions.
All paying lip service to the Peshwa, but really just looking out for number one.
It was a recipe for disaster when you're facing a unified opponent like the EIC. And the sources are clear. The relationship between these chiefs wasn't partnership. It was active, corrosive rivalry.
Especially between Scindia and Holkar. That rivalry was like a fatal flaw in the system that the British just knew how to exploit.
It wasn't just political disagreement. We're talking about open warfare between them. For decades before the British really got involved in the Second War, Scindia and Holkar were fighting these brutal battles against each other.
Bleeding each other dry.
Wasting their best troops, draining their treasuries. They were more worried about their rival gaining influence at the Peshwa's court in Pune than they were about the growing foreign threat. They're essentially softening each other up for the EIC.
Which means the EIC didn't have to take on this massive Maratha state all at once?
Not at all. They just had to wait for the next internal squabble, find the crack in the foundation, and apply a little pressure.
And that decentralized rivalrous structure, It was the perfect entry point for the classic divide and conquer strategy.
Perfect. They could ally with one chief against another, or, as we'll see, they could ally with a desperate Peshwa against all the chiefs.
Which brings us to the First War. Let's turn to that first flashpoint then. The First Anglo-Maratha War, which kicks off in 1775. What's so interesting is that this wasn't some grand strategy from London or even from the EIC headquarters in Calcutta.
No, not at all. It was a local power grab.
Yeah.
It was the British government in Bombay.
The Bombay presidency.
Yes, and they were feeling, well, a bit left out. They looked at the huge revenues and territories their counterparts in Bengal and Madras were grabbing, and they felt insignificant.
They wanted a piece of the action.
They wanted to expand, and specifically, they desperately coveted the Maratha territories of Salsette and Dassain.
Which are right next to Bombay. Strategically vital.
Absolutely. Salsette in particular was crucial for the physical security of Bombay Island, so they needed an excuse, a way in, and the Maratha court just handed it to them on a silver platter.
A succession crisis, the classic opportunity.
The classic opportunity. The Peshwa, Narayan Rao, was assassinated, creating a power vacuum. His uncle, a man named Raghunath Rao, also known as Raghoba, wanted the throne.
But he was blocked.
He was. A council of powerful ministers, led by the brilliant statesman Nana Fednavis, installed Narayan Rao's infant son as the rightful Peshwa instead.
So Raghoba is out in the cold, his ambitions are crushed, and he makes the decision that changes everything.
He goes to the British. He approaches the Bombay government for military aid.
And Bombay must have jumped at the chance.
Immediately. This led to the Treaty of Surat in 1775. The deal was simple. Bombay provides 2,500 soldiers to help Raghoba, and in return, he gives them what they want.
Salsette and Vassain.
Salsette, Bassein, and a share of the revenues from other territories. It seemed like a straightforward, if cynical, bargain.
But the execution was a mess from day one.
A total mess.
Yeah.
And it really shows the lack of coordination within the EIC itself. They won an initial battle, the Battle of Aras, but Pune, the capital, remained firmly under Nana Fednavis's control.
And then the bosses in Calcutta found out what Bombay had done.
Exactly. The Supreme Council in Calcutta, led by Governor General Warren Hastings, was furious. They saw the Bombay government as reckless, unauthorized, and starting a major war that could endanger the whole company.
So they stepped in and declared the whole thing illegal.
They did. They declared the Treaty of Surat void and sent their own man to negotiate a peace. This led to a complete reversal.
The Treaty of Purandar in 1776.
Right. And with this new treaty, they completely abandoned Raghunath Rao. They offered him a pension and basically tried to reset everything, although they did manage to hang on to Salsette.
But that peace barely lasted. What dragged Hastings back into a war he so clearly wanted to avoid?
The global situation. You have to remember, the American War of Independence is raging.
And France is looking for any opportunity to strike at Britain.
Anywhere in the world. So in 1778, when news reaches Hastings that a French adventurer has shown up in Pune and is offering military help to the Marathas, he panics.
The thought of a Franco-Maratha alliance was the ultimate nightmare scenario.
It changed everything. Suddenly, the risk of war was less than the risk of inaction. Hastings tore up the Treaty of Purandar and sent a massive British force marching west.
Which leads directly to one of the most humiliating defeats in the EIC's history.
The Wadgaon Campaign. This is where you see Maratha tactical brilliance at its best.
The British were overconfident.
Very. They marched into the rugged terrain of the Western Ghats expecting a standard battle. But the Maratha general, the great Mahaji Shinde, he wasn't going to give them one.
He lured them in.
He lured them deep into the hills, far from their supply lines. At the Battle of Taligan in 1779, he cut them off.
And then hit them with that devastating logistical strategy.
The scorched earth policy. It was brutal. Shinde's forces burned every farm, torched every village, poisoned the wells. They denied the British army any food or water.
The sources paint this incredible picture of a modern, disciplined army just starving.
Trapped.
Completely trapped. Their supply lines were cut, the monsoon rains turned the ground to mud, and their soldiers were dying of hunger and disease. It was a total breakdown. They had no choice but to surrender.
A humiliating surrender. They signed the Treaty of Wadgaon, agreeing to return all conquered lands and even handing over 2 British officials as hostages. It was a complete and utter defeat.
But Warren Hastings was not the kind of man to accept that.
Not for a second. He was in Calcutta, and when he heard the news, he was livid. He dismissed the treaty as invalid and immediately mobilized the company's vast resources to reverse the humiliation.
He sent in new armies.
2 fresh, highly capable armies. One under Colonel Goddard, who went on to capture Ahmedabad and, crucially, Visay, or Bassein, which was the original prize,
And the other force.
under a Captain Pavam, who pulled off this brilliant, daring nighttime assault to capture the supposedly impregnable fortress of Gwalior, Mahaji Scindia's own stronghold.
This relentless pressure, this ability to just keep sending more men and more money, must have been demoralizing for the Marathas.
It showed the EIC's real strength wasn't just in any single battle, but in its deep pockets and its ability to absorb losses and keep fighting. It forced the Marathas back to the negotiating table.
Which brings us to the end of the First War.
The Treaty of Salabai in 1782. And what's really significant is who mediated it: Mahaji Scindia. It shows he's now the key diplomatic player in the Confederacy.
So, what were the final terms after 7 long, chaotic years of war?
Well, it looks like a diplomatic draw on the surface. The British got to keep Salsette, their one key objective near Bombay, but they had to return everything else, including Bassein.
And they officially recognized the infant Peshwa and finally cut Raghunath Rao loose.
For good this time, so the Marathas kept their sovereignty intact.
But you said it was a draw on the surface. What was the real victory for the British?
Time. The treaty bought them 20 years of peace with the Marathas. 20 crucial years.
Time they could use to focus on their other great rival.
Exactly. It completely neutralized the Marathas, allowing the EIC to pour all its military resources into the south and finally focus on defeating Tipu Sultan of Mysore. That 20-year peace was the real strategic prize.
Okay, so for 20 years, the British consolidate their power, they eliminate Mysore, they strengthen their hold on Bengal and Madras, and by 1800, the stage is set for round 2 with the Marathas.
And, just like before, the Marathas themselves provided the opening. The fragile peace that held the Confederacy together shattered in 1800 with the death of one man.
Nafed Navis.
The brilliant minister who had managed to keep the rival chiefs in check. With him gone, the internal conflicts that had been simmering just exploded.
The leadership vacuum was total.
And the old rivalries flared up immediately. Scindia and Holkar went back to open war, fighting for control over the young Peshwa in Pune.
And this chaos was the perfect environment for the new and arguably most aggressive Governor-General to arrive.
Lord Wellesley. He arrived with a completely different mandate from his predecessors. He wasn't just looking for territory, he was looking for total control.
And he had a specific tool for this. A political weapon that we absolutely have to unpack to understand what happens next.
The subsidiary alliance system.
This is central to everything, isn't it? It's how the EIC took over huge parts of India without having to fight for every inch.
It was genius,
Yeah.
in a ruthless kind of way. It was economic and military coercion, but it was disguised as a treaty of protection.
Let's walk through how it worked, because it was a political trap with no escape.
Okay, so if you were an Indian ruler and you signed a subsidiary alliance, you had to agree to several key terms. First, and most importantly, you had to disband your own army.
Removing your ability to defend yourself.
Absolutely. Second, you had to accept a permanent force of British troops, a subsidiary force stationed in your territory, supposedly for your protection.
And third,
Third, you had to accept a British official, a resident, at your court, and you had to surrender control of all your foreign relations to the British. You couldn't negotiate with any other state, Indian or European, without their permission.
so you're disarmed, you're politically isolated, and you've got a British spy living in your palace. But the killer part was who paid for those protective British troops.
Right. That was the financial genius of the system. The Indian ruler had to pay for them. The maintenance costs were deliberately set so high that most states couldn't possibly afford them.
So when they inevitably defaulted on the payments,
They were forced to give up or cede huge revenue-rich chunks of their own territory to the EIC as payment.
so the EIC gets the land, gets the revenue from that land to pay for its own army, and disarms its ally all at the same time. It's a self-funding colonization scheme.
It was incredibly effective. And the chaos among the Marathas provided Wellesley with a perfect desperate victim.
The new Peshwa, Bajirao II.
He was weak, he was incompetent, and he was terrified of his rivals, especially Yashwantrao Holkar.
Holkar's aggression basically chased him right into the British trap.
It did. Holkar defeated the Peshwa's forces, and Bajirao II literally fled for his life. He ran to the British at the port of Bassein and begged for their protection.
And there, in December 1802, he signed on the dotted line.
He signed the Treaty of Bassein, and with that signature, he effectively signed away Maratha independence.
What were the terms?
He accepted the full subsidiary alliance. He agreed to station 6,000 British troops in Pune and ceded territory worth millions of rupees to pay for them. But the crucial clause was the surrender of his foreign policy.
He had given up the sovereignty of the entire Maratha state, symbolically at least.
The other chiefs saw it as an act of absolute betrayal. Scindia and Bhonsle were furious.
They must have realized that if the British now controlled the Peshwa, they were next on the list.
Instantly, they saw it as an existential threat. They formed an alliance and prepared for war, demanding that the treaty be torn up.
Which kicks off the Second Anglo-Maratha War. But this time, the EIC is not the fractured, disorganized force from the First War.
No, this time they are prepared, unified, and led by exceptional military commanders. Wellesley unleashes a brilliant two-front war.
In the South, in the Deccan, he puts his own brother in command.
Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, and in the North, he has General Lake.
And Arthur Wellesley's campaign is the stuff of legend.
His victory at the Battle of Assaye in 1803 is considered one of the greatest of his entire career. He faced a massive combined army of Scindia and Bhonsle, who had modern French-trained infantry.
But he still won.
He won a crushing victory through sheer tactical genius and the superior discipline of his troops. He followed that up with another decisive win at the Battle of Argan. The Maratha armies in the south were shattered.
And at the same time, General Lake was doing the same thing in the north?
Just as effective. He won the Battle of Delhi and the Battle of Laswari, completely destroying Scindia's northern power base. It proved that even the best Maratha troops couldn't stand up to the concentrated firepower of the EIC.
And these huge defeats on the battlefield led directly to treaties of surrender.
In December 1803, yes. First, Bhonsle gave in and signed the Treaty of Diogan. He lost a huge amount of territory and had to accept a British resident.
And then Scindia?
Scindia signed the Treaty of Surgiarjango. This was devastating for him. He had to give up all the rich lands between the Ganga and Yamuna rivers.
The
Doab. A massive strategic and economic loss. And, of course, he also had to accept a resident.
And the capture of Delhi had another hugely symbolic consequence.
This is a monumental moment. For decades, the Mughal emperor in Delhi, the last symbol of the old empire, had been a pensioner and political pawn of the Marathas.
He was under their protection.
Now, with the British controlling Delhi, he fell under their authority. The Mughal emperor became a British pensioner. That single act symbolically confirmed that the EIC was the new imperial sovereign of India.
So, Scindia and Bhonsle are defeated, the Peshwa is a puppet, the war seems over.
Almost. But the one chief who had stayed out of the fight, Yashwant Rao Holkar, finally decided to jump in.
And he actually has some success, doesn't he?
He does. He shows what traditional Maratha-like cavalry tactics could still do. He used lightning raids, avoided pitched battles, and actually defeated a British force and threatened Delhi itself.
It kind of shows what might have happened if they'd all fought together from the start.
It really does. But just as Holkar is causing them real trouble, the EIC does something unexpected. They pause the war.
Why? They were so close to total victory.
2 reasons: money and Napoleon. The war had been incredibly expensive, and the company's directors in London were getting very worried about the cost.
And Napoleon was at the peak of his power in Europe.
Which was the much bigger threat from London's perspective. So they decided to cut their losses for the time being. Lord Wellesley was recalled to England for being too aggressive and too expensive.
And his replacement sued for peace.
The new Governor-General signed the Treaty of Rajpuragat with Holkar in 1805. Holkar got to keep most of his kingdom. It was a temporary truce driven by British finances.
So the result of the Second War wasn't total annexation.
Not yet, but the Maratha Confederacy as a political entity was shattered beyond repair. Its independence was gone.
So that peace, from 1805 to 1817, it really was just a pause, wasn't it? A chance for the British to reload.
And to consolidate. They spent that time building up the administration in all the new territories they'd acquired. And then, in 1813, the new man arrives.
Lord Hastings.
And he arrives with a clear mandate. Finish the job, establish absolute, unchallenged British supremacy across the entire subcontinent.
And this is where we have to talk about the machinery behind the conquest. You mentioned before how they were building new systems. How did Hastings fund this final massive military push?
This is the crucial, often overlooked part of the story. The EIC needed massive, predictable streams of cash to pay for its huge armies, so they revolutionized the tax system.
Moving away from the old ways of collecting revenue.
Exactly. Hastings' administration brought in 2 fundamental new systems. In the south, in Madras, they introduced the Raiwari system.
Where Rayat means farmer.
Correct. They bypassed all the middlemen, the old tax collectors, and collected land taxes directly from the individual peasant farmer.
And in the north?
In the Northwest, they used the Mahalwari system, where Mahal means village. There, the tax was assessed on the entire village community as a single unit.
Both systems designed for one thing.
Maximum revenue extraction. It gave them the financial backbone they needed to launch the final campaign. They could literally pay for the conquest with the wealth from the lands they already controlled.
So the financial engine is running, Hastings has the army, now he just needs a reason, a pretext for the final showdown.
And he finds it in the chaos being caused by the Pindaris.
Who were the Pindaris exactly?
There were bands of irregular horsemen, mercenaries, and plunderers who had historically followed Maratha armies. They were known for being incredibly fast and brutal. They weren't a formal army, more like organized bandits on a massive scale.
But their raids into British territory gave Hastings the perfect excuse.
The perfect excuse. He could frame the final war not as a war of conquest, but as a necessary police action to restore order. His official goal was to crush the Pindaris.
But his real unspoken goal
was to use the massive army he'd assembled to crush the last remnants of Maratha power at the same time. And he did. By 1818, the Pindari leaders were all captured or killed.
But before the main fighting even started, Hastings used a different tactic. He forced the remaining Maratha chiefs into submission with a series of humiliating treaties.
This was the final turn of the screw. He isolated them and legally dismantled what was left of their power before a single major battle was fought,
forcing them to sign away their sovereignty.
We see a rapid succession of these. The Treaty of Nagpur was forced on the Bansal chief. The Peshwa, Bajirao II, had to sign the Treaty of Pune in 1817, which officially forced him to dissolve the Maratha Confederacy.
And Scindia was forced to sign the Treaty of Gwalior, which made him actually help the British hunt the Pindaris.
Can you imagine the humiliation? Being forced to help your enemy destroy forces that were once allied to you.
This systematic pressure, it just pushed them too far. They realized they had nothing left to lose.
It was a final, desperate revolt. The Peshwa burned the British residency in Pune, which was a clear declaration of war. But it was too late. They were fighting as isolated individuals, not a confederacy.
And the British forces were just overwhelming.
The end came very quickly. The Peshwa was defeated at the Battle of Khadki. Bonslow was beaten at Sitabaldi. Holkar was crushed at the Battle of Mayapur.
And Holkar's defeat was sealed with one last treaty.
The Treaty of Mandsaur in 1818. He had to accept a British resident and give up all his claims on the neighboring Rajput states, which of course immediately signed subsidiary alliances with the British.
And what happened to the Peshwa, Bajirao II, the man whose actions started so much of this?
He was hunted down. He lost his last two desperate battles at Kurgan and Nashti in early 1818. And with his defeat, the British made a final, definitive political move.
They abolished the office of the Peshwa.
Entirely. The central political institution of the Maratha world was wiped off the map.
But they didn't execute him.
No, that wasn't their style. It was much smarter to turn him into a comfortable, irrelevant pensioner. They exiled him far away to a place called Bithur, near Kanpur, with a huge annual pension.
A classic move. Demonstrate British generosity while removing him from the game permanently.
And his vast territories in western India were annexed wholesale. They were used to create the core of the huge Bombay presidency.
But they made one small, clever concession, didn't they?
A very savvy move.
Yeah.
To appease Maratha sentiment and their deep loyalty to the founder, Shivaji, the British created a tiny symbolic kingdom called Satara for one of Shivaji's descendants. It was a powerless puppet state, but it gave the local population a focal point for their identity while the British held all the real power.
So by the time the dust settles in 1818, the map of India looks completely different.
It's a British map. Either through direct rule or through the web of subsidiary alliances, the EIC now controls virtually the entire subcontinent. The only major independent powers left are the Sikh Empire and the Punjab and Sindh. The Maratha age is over.
So we've traced this incredible arc. From the Marathas being the dominant power that could humiliate a British army at Wadgaon in 1779 to being completely dismantled just 40 years later.
And this deep dive really shows that the subsidiary alliance system, that brilliant, coercive political tool, was ultimately more decisive than the great victories at places like Assaye.
The structural weakness was everything. The Marathas had the strength, the numbers, the history, but they couldn't match the unified, single-minded focus of the EIC.
Never. every step of the way. From exploiting Ragoba's personal ambition to the final surrender at Bassein, the British advance was made possible because the Maratha chiefs could not or would not present a united front.
Their internal rivalries were the greatest colonial asset the British ever had.
And they leveraged it perfectly. The lesson here, for you, the listener, is that so often the foundations of empire are built not on the battlefield, but in the back office. They're administrative and financial.
By 1818, British dominance is complete. But let's leave you with a final thought to chew on.
How much of the long-term structure of the British Raj, the centralized bureaucracy, the taxation systems, the very way the government was run for the next 100 years, was directly enabled not by the wars themselves, but by the Nuk to manage the spoils of those wars?
You mean systems like Uriakwari and Mahalwari?
Exactly. Those foundational administrative systems weren't just about fighting wars, they were created to manage the vast territories acquired through treaties like Bassein and Sirjarjangoon. They set the template for everything that followed. So what knowledge of those foundational systems can you explore next to really understand the deep roots of imperial rule?
Food for thought indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the dismantling of the Maratha Confederacy.